Almost every prominent Nazi woman after 1945 told the same story. They'd been apolitical. They'd been kept in the dark. They'd loved a man, not a regime. But one of them, arguably the most decorated of them all, refused to play along. Hannah Reich flew Hitler's experimental rocket plane, pitched him on a kamikaze squadron in person, and was one of the last people to see him alive in the bunker beneath Berlin. And until the day she died in 1979, she still wore the Iron Cross with diamonds he had given her, and insisted that the only real guilt Germany should carry was losing the war. She wasn't the opposite of every female Nazi because she was secretly better. She was the opposite because she was the only one who never bothered to pretend. To feel how far the opposite goes, you have to see the mold first. The Nazi regime had a very specific idea of what a German woman was for. The slogan was Kinder, Kusch, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. A woman's highest contribution to the Reich was breeding the next generation of Aryans, keeping a clean home and staying carefully out of politics. The party even handed out medals for it. The Mother's Cross, awarded in bronze, silver, and gold, based on how many children you had produced. For children got you bronze, 8 got you gold. That was the official picture, and it shaped how almost every Nazi wife would be remembered after 1945. Lena Heydrich, Magda Goebbels, Margarete Himmler, Emmy Goering, Eva Braun. When they spoke in interrogations or wrote memoirs, the story was almost identical. They had loved their husbands, had been wives, not ideologues. Some ran charity work, some threw dinner parties. None of them, in their own telling, had any meaningful role in the Reich itself. The average female Nazi was a wife or a low-ranked functionary, and the moment the regime collapsed, she became a widow, a refugee, or a defendant pleading domestic ignorance. Most of them disappeared into small Munich apartments and quiet pensions, hoping their names would fade. Hannah Reich did not fit that mold for a single day. While her contemporaries were being told to have more children for the Führer, she was flying combat aircraft for him. How does a doctor's daughter from Silesia end up there? She was born in 1912 in Hirschberg, a small spa town in what was then Eastern Germany, and is now part of Poland. Her father wanted her to study medicine. She started dutifully in the early 1930s and then quietly walked away from it because she had fallen in love with something else entirely. In her own memoir, she described the pull of flight as a deep, insistent homesickness. The feeling she got watching birds and clouds like she was supposed to be up there with them. She started with gliders, riding silent air currents over the Silesian hills, and she was extraordinary at it almost immediately. By 1932, she was the first German woman to hold a captain's flight license. The records kept piling up. Distance, altitude, endurance, until she had passed 40 across her career. She became the first German woman to fly a helicopter. She became one of the very first humans of any gender to fly a rocket-powered aircraft. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet, a tiny screaming wedge of fuel and ambition that killed several of the male test pilots who flew it. Reich survived a near-fatal crash in one and went back up. By 1942, she was the first woman in Germany to hold both the Iron Cross Second Class and the Iron Cross First Class. Nazi propaganda fell on her like a gift. Here was the perfect Aryan poster girl. Blonde, fearless, brilliant, and visibly, photogenically loyal. The regime printed her. Photographs everywhere. They used her to argue that German women could be both beautiful and brave, both feminine and committed. That fame came with something nobody else around her ever got. It bought her direct, personal, repeated access to Adolf Hitler. And if you're into the corners of World War II history that don't make the documentaries, hit subscribe. There's a new one every week, because what Hannah Reich did with that access is where this story stops being a propaganda fairy tale. On February 28, 1944, while women across Germany were being told that their highest duty was the home, Hannah Reich walked into Hitler Mountain Retreat at Berchtesgaden and personally pitched him on suicide pilots. The idea was simple and horrifying. Take German pilots, strap them into modified V-1 flying bombs and Mi-328 aircraft, remove the parachutes and aim them at Allied warships and bomber formations. The pilot would fly the weapon all the way in. There was no escape mechanism, no recovery plan, no second mission. Each man would die on impact. Reich believed in it completely. She had personally test-flown a piloted version of the V-1, demonstrating the concept herself before she ever brought it to the Führer. She framed it to Hitler as a final act of devotion. Pilots so loyal to the Reich that they would trade their lives for guaranteed hits. He listened, and although he didn't immediately approve it, he didn't dismiss it either. He passed it to the Luftwaffe to evaluate. Recruiting began almost immediately. Around 70 men eventually signed the suicide pledges that fed into what later became known, loosely, as the Leonidas Squadron, a Luftwaffe formation linked to the broader concept Reich had championed. The pilots wrote letters home. They pre-recorded their final messages. Some of them were genuinely true believers. Others were desperate young men who saw no other way to feel useful as the Reich collapsed around them. The program never reached the scale Reich wanted. It died not on moral grounds but on technical and strategic ones. By 1944, Germany no longer had the air superiority needed to even get suicide pilots close to their targets. A handful of missions were eventually flown in the war's final weeks against Soviet bridges, with limited effect. This is the part of her story that most people skip. It is much easier to remember Hannah Reich as the brave little aviator who flew into Berlin than as the woman who stood in a mountain villa and convinced a dictator to send 70 young men to certain death. She was not a passive enabler. She was an architect. She wanted the program to be bigger and more ambitious than it ever became. A year after the pitch, she would put her own life into exactly that gear. By late April 1945, there was nowhere left to fly except down. The Soviets were closing on Berlin from three sides. The Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Hitler was in his concrete bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, holding what was left of the regime together by force of paranoia. And he summoned Field Marshal Robert Ritter von Greim to the bunker for a face-to-face meeting. Hannah Reich flew him there. On April 26th, the two of them lifted off from Rechlin Airfield in a tiny Fiesler Storch. A slow, fragile reconnaissance aircraft, the kind of plane you would never choose to fly through the airspace over a besieged capital. Soviet anti-aircraft fire found them almost immediately. Greim was hit in the foot. Reich took the controls and brought the plane down on a makeshift strip in the Tiergarten, the Central Park, now a wasteland of burning vehicles, broken trees, and shell craters. She walked Greim through the streets to the bunker entrance while Berlin burned around them. She spent several days inside the Führer bunker. She watched Hitler, a shaking, half-medicated man, sign off on the dismissal of Hermann Göring for treason. She watched him appoint Greim the new chief of the Luftwaffe, a job that no longer commanded anything. She watched the staff prepare for collective suicide, with cyanide capsules distributed like favors at a wedding. According to her own later testimony to American interrogators, she begged Hitler to let her stay and die there with him. He refused, telling her she had to fly Greim out, that the new Luftwaffe chief was needed alive. So on April 30th, the same day Hitler killed himself, Hannah Reich took off from a damaged street near the Brandenburg Gate, flying through anti-aircraft fire and debris in what was essentially the last German warplane to leave Berlin. In her flight gear, she was carrying letters from Eva Braun to her sister Gretel. She managed to escape, but Hitler did not, and for the rest of her life she would talk about those days in the bunker not as a terrible experience she had endured, but as a special opportunity she had been given. The bunker wasn't the end of her story, and what she did after is what makes her the complete opposite of every female Nazi. The Americans arrested her in May 1945 and kept her for about 15 months. Their investigators questioned her thoroughly. Her account of Hitler's final days became one of the main first-hand sources for everything historians would later document about the bunker. American officials described her testimony, in their own words, as likely the best single eyewitness report they had on the subject. But they also observed something that bothered them. She wasn't broken. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't using the "I was just a wife" defense that other Nazi women were employing during their interrogations down the hall. She told the Americans calmly that she would do all of it again. She maintained that position for the rest of her life. In interviews later in life, when reporters showed up hoping for the typical German show of remorse, Reich refused to provide it. She stated officially that she wasn't ashamed that she had believed in National Socialism. She mentioned she still wore the Iron Cross with diamonds Hitler had personally given her, and she meant that quite literally. She wore it publicly, and photos from her later years show it fastened to her flight jacket. She also had views on modern Germany, and she expressed them openly. Post-war Germany, she said, had become a nation of bankers and car manufacturers, a country where soldiers had beards and questioned their orders. It disgusted her. The only real fault the German people shared, she argued, was that they had lost. Consider the contrast for a moment. While Eva Braun's family disappeared into a small apartment in Munich and refused to give any interviews for the rest of their lives, while Margaret Himmler lived under a fake name and pretended not to be herself, while the wives of camp guards cried on the witness stand and claimed they had never known what their husbands actually did, while the entire German post-war narrative was being built on shame and silence, Hannah Reich sat in front of cameras, wearing a medal personally awarded by Adolf Hitler, and told journalists that the war had been worth fighting and her only regret was the outcome. She wasn't faking it and she wasn't playing a game. She genuinely believed every word. The denazification system had a problem with her, and no one was quite sure how to resolve it. She had been Hitler's favorite female pilot. She had personally urged him to deploy suicide attack squadrons. She had been an insider in the bunker during the regime's final days. She had carried Eva Braun's letters out of Berlin in the last hours of the Reich. By any reasonable standard, she was one of the most deeply involved women in Nazi Germany. But there was one thing she had never done. She had never officially joined the NSDAP. She had never signed a party membership card under the denazification system that the Allies had established, a system that depended significantly on who had been a registered member of which Nazi organization. That single technicality was extremely important. The classification system ranged from major offenders at the top, through offenders, minor offenders, and followers, all the way down to the least severe category in the entire system, designated for those found not involved with the regime. Entlastet in German, meaning not affected in English. In 1947, after approximately 15 months in American custody, Hannah Reich was officially classified as not affected. The Iron Cross with diamonds, the Berchtesgaden pitch, the bunker, none of it was enough to outweigh the absence of a party card. So while ordinary German typists and clerks who had once completed NSDAP forms served prison sentences and lost their pensions, the woman who had supported kamikaze missions went free. The legal exception that allowed her to leave is the basis on which the rest of her life was built. Without it, none of what happened next would have been possible. She went to places that, officially, should never have accepted her. In the late 1950s, Reich was advising the Indian government on aviation matters. She became friends with Indira Gandhi, who would later become Prime Minister, and met Jawaharlal Nehru, the person who designed post-colonial anti-imperial India. These were leaders who were clearly opposed to everything fascism had represented. They knew who she had been. They invited her regardless because she was an exceptional aviator and India was a country attempting to establish an aviation culture from virtually nothing. Then, between 1962 and 1966, she did something even more remarkable. She moved to Accra, Ghana, and managed the country's national gliding school. She had been personally invited by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of independent Ghana, a Pan-African socialist, a leader of the global movement against colonialism and racial inequality. Nkrumah's Ghana was intended to be the moral counterpoint to everything the Third Reich had stood for, and he hired Hannah Reich to train his pilots. People at the time in Accra remembered two things about her. The first was that she was an outstanding flight instructor, patient, technically precise, demanding the same high standards from her African students that she had once expected of herself. The second was that she still, sometimes, wore the Iron Cross in Accra while teaching the children of a nation founded on the rejection of European racial superiority. Nobody in Ghana seemed quite sure what to do about that, because the arrangement was working. She could teach, the school needed a teacher, and the political conflict was quietly set aside. This is the most unusual part of her life, and the section that reveals the most about how the post-war world actually dealt with Nazis. Not with the moral certainty we like to think about in hindsight, but with indifference, with practicality, with the readiness to utilize a skilled pilot regardless of how she had acquired that ability. To truly grasp how deliberate all of this was, you need to know she had a near counterpart. Melita von Stauffenberg was exactly the same age as Hannah Reich. Same generation, same Luftwaffe, same recognized status as a female test pilot, same Iron Cross. She had all the advantages Reich had in almost identical measures, working from within almost the same offices. Melita used her access in a different way. She was the sister-in-law of Klaus von Stauffenberg, the colonel who came closest to assassinating Hitler in the July 1944 plot. Melita utilized her celebrity as an aviator, her connections, and her freedom of movement to protect her family involved in the resistance. After the plot failed and Klaus was executed, the Gestapo arrested most of the Stauffenberg family and sent them to concentration camps. Melita spent the final months of the war flying frequently to those camps to bring them food, news, and whatever protection her name could provide. She died in April 1945, shot down by an American fighter while on another mission to reach her imprisoned in-laws. Same profession, same training, same opportunities, same regime, opposite decision. This is the aspect of the story that is most important for the promise made in the title. Hannah Reich is not the opposite of every female Nazi because circumstances pushed her into that role. She is the opposite because holding the same opportunities that Melita von Stauffenberg had, she made a different choice. She had every chance to use her influence the way Melita did, and she did not take it. She used that influence instead to advocate for suicide missions and to transport Eva Braun's letters. Her lack of remorse was not an accidental personality trait. Maine on August 24, 1979. She was 67 years old. The cause was a heart attack. Earlier that same year, she set her final gliding record in the United States, the country whose interrogators had held her for 15 months. She left behind an unrepentant Nazi who everyone had ultimately let off the hook. We picture Margaret Himmler in her widow's clothes, denying everything. She was visible where they were hidden away. She wasn't the opposite of every female Nazi simply because she escaped them. Please like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next upload.